Commander Yamamoto Kenji stood on the bridge of the destroyer escort Hasu in the pre-dawn darkness of October 24, 1944, watching the phosphorescent wake of his convoy stretching toward the China coast. The convoy consisted of 11 precious tankers and transports, each one loaded to capacity with aviation fuel, ammunition, and rice for the desperate garrison defending the Philippines. The Matsumoto Maru, a 7,024-ton auxiliary fleet tanker, led the column, her massive hull riding low in the water from the weight of fuel oil in her tanks. Behind her sailed the brand-new Ebara Maru, commissioned just months earlier, carrying enough aviation gasoline to keep the Japanese Army Air Force flying for weeks. What Yamamoto didn't know was that beneath the dark waters of the Formosa Strait, an American submarine had been tracking his convoy for the past 3 hours. The USS Tang, commanded by the legendary Richard O'Kane, had positioned herself perfectly for what would become one of the most devastating submarine attacks of the Pacific War. The Japanese convoy commanders had no idea that American submarines had evolved from cautious hunters into aggressive wolfpack predators that would attack on the surface at night, firing spreads of torpedoes from point-blank range with devastating accuracy. The Japanese Naval High Command in Tokyo had assured convoy commanders that American submarines were cowardly vessels that only attacked from deep water during daylight hours. They believed their destroyer escorts and patrol aircraft would keep the underwater menace at bay. This fatal miscalculation would cost Japan dearly. By October 1944, American submarines had already sent over 2 million tons of Japanese shipping to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The submarines of the United States Navy's Pacific Fleet had become the silent service, operating with deadly efficiency from forward bases at Pearl Harbor, Midway, and Australia. Captain Tanaka Hiroshi of the Matsumoto Maru had sailed these waters for 15 years. He knew every current, every reef, every safe anchorage along the China coast. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what was about to happen. The convoy had been routed close to the Chinese mainland, hugging the coast near Foochow to avoid the American submarines that Japanese intelligence believed operated only in deep water. This tactical decision, based on flawed assumptions about American submarine doctrine, would prove catastrophic. The convoy's escorts consisted of the destroyers Hasu and Tsuga, along with several smaller patrol boats. Commander Yamamoto had positioned his escorts in what he believed was an impenetrable screen around the precious cargo ships. The destroyer escorts maintained a constant sonar watch, their operators listening intently for the telltale sound of submarine screws. But the Americans had learned to attack on the surface at night, using their diesel engines for speed and maneuverability that no submerged vessel could match. At 0200 hours, the first indication of danger came not from sonar, but from a lookout on the Matsumoto Maru, who spotted a phosphorescent wake approaching at high speed from the port quarter. Before he could raise the alarm, for Mark 18 electric torpedoes were already racing toward the convoy at 46 knots. Commander O'Kane had fired a perfect spread from just 1,500 yards, so close that the Japanese escorts hadn't detected the Tang on their radar screens. The first torpedo struck the Matsumoto Maru just forward of her engine room. The explosion lifted the massive tanker out of the water, breaking her keel instantly. Aviation fuel erupted in a pillar of flame that illuminated the entire convoy like a giant flare. Captain Tanaka was thrown against the bridge windows by the force of the blast. When he regained his footing, he saw that his ship was already listing heavily to port, flames spreading across the fuel-soaked deck. 20 seconds later, the second and third torpedoes slammed into the Ebara Maru. The new tanker simply disintegrated. Her cargo of high-octane aviation gasoline detonated in a massive fireball that could be seen from the Chinese coast 20 miles away. The concussion from the explosion shattered windows on ships a mile distant. Burning fuel oil spread across the water's surface, turning the sea into an inferno. Commander Yamamoto watched in horror as his convoy descended into chaos. The destroyer escorts fired star shells, trying desperately to illuminate the attacker. But the Tang had already turned away at flank speed, her low profile invisible against the dark horizon. The Japanese escorts opened fire with every gun they possessed, sending streams of tracer rounds into the darkness. In their panic, they began firing at each other, each escort convinced that the submarine must be where they saw muzzle flashes. Lieutenant Suzuki Takashi, commanding the patrol boat number 38, later described the scene as resembling the Buddhist concept of hell. Ships were burning, men were screaming in the water, and the escorts were shooting at shadows while the real enemy disappeared into the night. The highly trained crews of the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet had been reduced to frightened sailors firing blindly into the darkness. The tactical genius of the American submarine commanders had completely overturned Japanese naval doctrine. For 3 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had focused on preparing for a decisive surface battle with American battleships and aircraft carriers. They had never imagined that their merchant marine, the lifeline of the empire, would be systematically destroyed by submarines operating like surface raiders. In the convoy's emergency radio room, the operator frantically transmitted a distress signal to naval headquarters at Takao, Formosa. The message was brief but terrifying in its implications. Large convoy under submarine attack in Formosa Strait. Matsumoto Maru and Ebara Maru torpedoed and sinking. Request immediate air support and rescue vessels. The message would spark panic at the highest levels of Japanese naval command. Vice Admiral Shima Kiyohide, commanding the Southwest Area Fleet from his headquarters in Manila, received the message at 0215 hours. He immediately understood the strategic implications. The convoy had been carrying critical supplies for the defense of the Philippines, where American forces had just landed at Leyte Gulf 4 days earlier. Without those supplies, particularly the aviation fuel, the Japanese Army Air Force would be grounded within weeks. The admiral summoned his staff for an emergency meeting. Captain Morita, his chief of staff, presented the grim statistics. In the past month alone, American submarines had sunk 43 cargo vessels in the waters between Formosa and the Philippines. The submarine menace had evolved from a nuisance to an existential threat to Japan's ability to wage war. The Americans were strangling Japan's supply lines with ruthless efficiency. Back in the Formosa Strait, the burning convoy had become a scene of unimaginable horror. Hundreds of sailors had jumped from the burning tankers into the oil-covered sea. The surface of the water was on fire, and men had to choose between drowning or burning alive. The destroyer escorts, still firing wildly into the darkness, could not stop to rescue survivors without making themselves stationary targets for the submarine they knew was still out there, watching. The Tang had indeed remained in the area, circling at high speed on the surface to make another attack run. Commander O'Kane watched through his binoculars as the Japanese escorts exhausted their ammunition firing at phantom targets. He ordered his crew to reload the forward torpedo tubes while the submarine maneuvered for a second attack. The Japanese convoy, now illuminated by the burning tankers, was completely vulnerable. At 0230 hours, the Tang struck again. This time, O'Kane targeted the transport ships that were desperately trying to escape the carnage. For more torpedoes streaked through the darkness. The 6,856-ton transport Yuzon Maru No. 2 took 2 hits amidships and immediately began to capsize. The 1,944-ton Tatsuju Maru was struck by a single torpedo that detonated her cargo of ammunition. The explosion was so powerful that it created a mushroom cloud visible from the Chinese coast. Commander Yamamoto, his uniform soaked with sweat despite the cool October night, ordered his destroyer to charge toward the latest torpedo wakes. But by the time the Hasu reached the firing position, the Tang had vanished again into the darkness. The American submarine's diesel engines gave her a surface speed of over 20 knots, faster than the escort destroyers could match while also maintaining their sonar search. The Japanese Navy's anti-submarine doctrine, developed in the 1930s and barely updated since, was completely inadequate against American wolfpack tactics. Japanese escorts were trained to hunt submarines that attacked submerged during daylight, moving slowly and cautiously. They were not prepared for submarines that attacked like motor torpedo boats, striking fast on the surface and then disappearing into the vast Pacific night. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura, captain of the destroyer Tsuga, later testified at a naval inquiry that fighting the American submarines was like fighting ghosts. They appeared from nowhere, struck with devastating precision, and vanished before the escorts could react. The psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel was profound. Sailors who had once been confident in the superiority of the Imperial Navy now dreaded convoy duty. The 901st Naval Air Group, Japan's first unit created exclusively for anti-submarine warfare, had been formed earlier in 1944, but it was woefully undertrained and under-equipped. The unit had no established doctrine, no specialized equipment, and its pilots had never trained for hunting submarines before being thrown into combat. When dawn finally broke on October 24th, the air group launched every available aircraft to search for the American submarine. The reconnaissance planes found only oil slicks, debris, and hundreds of bodies floating in the Formosa Strait. The Tang had submerged before dawn and was already moving toward her next hunting ground. 5 ships from the convoy had been sunk in less than an hour, taking with them over 25,000 tons of desperately needed supplies. More importantly, over 800 experienced merchant sailors had been killed, men who could never be replaced. At Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, the news of the Convoy massacre caused near panic. Admiral Oikawa Koshiro, commander of the General Escort Command, was summoned to explain how American submarines continued to devastate Japanese shipping despite all countermeasures. The admiral's report was brutally honest. The Americans had better submarines, better torpedoes, better radar, and better tactics. But most importantly, they had better intelligence. Unknown to the Japanese, American codebreakers at Pearl Harbor were reading Japanese naval communications almost in real time. The Submarine Operations Center at Pearl Harbor knew the route, composition, and escort strength of almost every Japanese convoy before it sailed. This intelligence, combined with aggressive wolfpack tactics, had turned American submarines into the most effective ship killers in the Pacific War. The Japanese 6th Fleet's submarine force, once considered among the best in the world, had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength. While Japanese submarines had achieved some spectacular successes early in the war, including sinking the carriers USS Yorktown and USS Wasp, they had failed to adapt to changing conditions. Japanese submarine doctrine still emphasized attacks on warships rather than merchant vessels, a strategic error that would prove fatal. Captain Morita, studying the convoy loss reports at Southwest Area Fleet Headquarters, noticed a disturbing pattern. American submarines were no longer operating as lone wolves. They were coordinating their attacks, with multiple submarines attacking the same convoy from different directions. The Americans had adopted and improved upon the German U-boat wolfpack tactics that had nearly strangled Britain in the Atlantic. The Japanese Navy's response to the submarine crisis was too little, too late. The Naval General Staff ordered the construction of more escort vessels, but Japan's shipyards were already operating beyond capacity. The quality of new escorts was poor, with many vessels lacking proper sonar equipment or depth charge projectors. The escort crews were inexperienced, often merchant sailors given minimal naval training before being sent to sea. Meanwhile, the Tang continued her deadly patrol in the Formosa Strait. On the night of October 24th to 25th, O'Kane detected another convoy trying to sneak through the strait under cover of darkness. This convoy had learned from the previous night's disaster and was zigzagging wildly, with escorts actively pinging their sonar. But the American submarine commander had 1 torpedo remaining, and he was determined to use it. The Tang surfaced in the middle of the convoy, so close to a Japanese transport that sailors on both vessels could see each other in the moonlight. O'Kane ordered the last torpedo fired at the transport from point-blank range. In a tragic twist of fate that would save countless Japanese lives, the Mark 18 torpedo malfunctioned, circling back to strike the Tang herself. The American submarine, which had sunk more Japanese ships than any other, was destroyed by her own weapon. The irony was not lost on the Japanese sailors who pulled 9 American survivors from the water, including Commander O'Kane. Here was the most successful submarine commander in the American Navy, responsible for sinking 33 Japanese ships, now a prisoner of war. The Japanese, desperate to understand American submarine tactics, interrogated O'Kane relentlessly. But the damage had already been done. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, recognized that conventional tactics could no longer protect Japanese shipping. In desperation, he proposed using kamikaze attacks against American submarines on the surface. But submarines were small, fast-moving targets that could crash dive in less than 30 seconds. The sacrifice of Japanese pilots against such elusive targets would be futile. The psychological impact of the submarine campaign on Japanese merchant sailors was devastating. Ships' crews began deserting in port rather than face another voyage through submarine-infested waters. The Merchant Marine Training School at Kobe reported that new recruits were refusing to report for duty. The emperor's subjects, who had been told they were winning the war, could see the truth in every empty shop shelf and rationed meal. By November 1944, Japan's monthly shipping losses had reached 265,068 gross tons, far exceeding the nation's shipbuilding capacity. The mathematics of defeat were simple and inexorable. Japan needed 6 million tons of shipping to maintain both its economy and military. By late 1944, losses to American submarines had reduced the merchant fleet to less than 2 million tons. The empire was being strangled. Commander Yamamoto, who had survived the October 24 Convoy massacre, was assigned to escort another convoy in November 1944. This time, the convoy consisted of only 3 ships, all that could be assembled for the vital supply run to the Philippines. The commander knew that American submarines were waiting somewhere in the darkness, but he had no choice but to proceed. Japan's strategic position demanded that the convoys continue sailing, regardless of losses. The evolution of American submarine warfare had caught the Imperial Japanese Navy completely unprepared. The Japanese had studied British anti-submarine tactics from World War I and the early years of World War II, but the Americans had developed entirely new methods. American submarines used radar to track convoys at night, attacked on the surface for maximum speed and maneuverability, and coordinated their attacks through radio communications that Japanese intelligence could not decode. The submarine war's impact extended far beyond shipping losses. Japan's inability to import raw materials crippled war production. Aircraft factories could not obtain aluminum, shipyards ran out of steel, and munitions plants lacked chemicals for explosives. The Japanese Army Air Force, which had dominated Asian skies in 1942, was reduced to hoarding fuel for only the most critical missions by late 1944. Food shortages caused by the submarine blockade were even more devastating than military supply problems. Japan had always depended on imported rice from Korea and Southeast Asia to feed its population. With merchant ships being sunk faster than they could be replaced, food imports dropped to a trickle. By early 1945, the daily caloric intake in Japanese cities had fallen below 2,000 calories per person, the minimum needed to sustain health. The Japanese Navy's failure to protect merchant shipping would be identified by post-war analysts as one of the primary causes of Japan's defeat. Admiral Oikawa, in his post-war testimony to American investigators, admitted that the Navy had never seriously considered that submarines could threaten Japan's survival. The focus had always been on preparing for a decisive battle between surface fleets, the glorious engagement that would determine the war's outcome. Lieutenant Suzuki, who had commanded Patrol Boat No. 38 during the October Convoy massacre, survived the war and later wrote about his experiences. He described the terror of convoy duty, never knowing when torpedoes would strike from the darkness. The American submarines had turned the vast Pacific Ocean into a killing ground where Japanese sailors died not in glorious battle, but in desperate struggles to keep their ships afloat long enough to reach port. The technical superiority of American submarines became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. The fleet boats of the Balao and Tench classes could dive deeper, travel farther, and carry more torpedoes than their Japanese counterparts. American submarines had air conditioning, advanced radar, and mechanical computers for fire control. Japanese submarines, many built in the 1930s, lacked these advantages and suffered heavy losses when they encountered American destroyers. The human cost of the submarine war was staggering. By war's end, American submarines had sunk over 1,100 Japanese merchant vessels and nearly 200 warships. More than 100,000 Japanese merchant sailors died, many of them burned alive in oil-covered waters or trapped in sinking ships. These losses, combined with those inflicted by American aircraft and mines, reduced Japan's merchant marine from 6,400,000 tons in 1941 to less than 500,000 tons by August 1945. The strategic implications of the submarine campaign extended beyond material losses. Japan's inability to reinforce and supply its scattered garrisons meant that isolated Japanese forces were left to fight hopeless battles without support. The garrison at Rabaul, once a major Japanese base, was reduced to growing vegetables to avoid starvation. The Philippines garrison, which the October 24th convoy had been trying to supply, ran out of ammunition during the American invasion. Admiral Somu Toyoda, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, later admitted that the submarine war had been decisive in Japan's defeat. The Americans had achieved with 300 submarines what the massive Japanese battle fleet could not accomplish with its battleships and carriers. The silent service had proven that modern war was not about glorious surface engagements but about the mundane work of sinking cargo ships carrying rice, oil, and rubber. The impact of American submarine operations forced the Japanese to divert enormous resources to anti-submarine warfare. Hundreds of aircraft that could have been used against American invasion forces were instead assigned to convoy protection. Destroyers desperately needed for fleet operations were relegated to escort duty. The Imperial Japanese Navy, designed for offensive operations, found itself playing a losing defensive game against an enemy it could rarely see. Captain Tanaka, who had miraculously survived the sinking of the Matsumoto Maru, was reassigned to command another tanker in December 1944. On his first voyage, his ship was torpedoed by the submarine USS Seahorse off the coast of Indochina. This time, Tanaka did not survive. His death was one of thousands that demonstrated the relentless efficiency of American submarine warfare. The Japanese naval officers who survived the war would spend years analyzing their failure to counter the submarine threat. Many blamed the rigid thinking of the Naval General Staff, which had refused to adapt doctrine even as losses mounted. Others pointed to Japan's failure to develop effective radar and sonar technology. But the fundamental problem was strategic. Japan had never planned for a war of attrition against American industrial might. Commander Yamamoto, reflecting on the Convoy massacre years after the war, identified the moment when he realized Japan would lose. It was not when the atomic bombs fell or when the emperor announced surrender. It was that night in October 1944, watching his convoy burn in the Formosa Strait while the American submarine disappeared into the darkness. At that moment, he understood that Japan was fighting an enemy it could not see, could not catch, and could not defeat. The American submarine force's achievement in the Pacific War was unprecedented in naval history. Operating from bases thousands of miles from home, American submarines had cut the maritime lifelines of an island empire. The submarines of the United States Navy's Pacific Fleet had proven that sea power in the modern age was not about controlling the ocean's surface but about denying its use to the enemy. The wolfpack tactics that had terrified Commander Yamamoto and his fellow convoy escorts represented a revolution in naval warfare. The Americans had taken the German U-boat concept and perfected it, adding technological innovations and aggressive doctrine that the Japanese could not counter. The silent service had shown that submarines, once considered auxiliary vessels, could be war-winning weapons. The story of the October 24, 1944, Convoy massacre in the Formosa Strait exemplified the submarine war's brutal efficiency. In less than an hour, a single American submarine had sunk 5 ships, killed 800 sailors, and destroyed supplies that could have extended Japanese resistance in the Philippines by months. The tactical success had strategic implications that rippled throughout the Japanese war effort. The survivors of Japan's merchant marine would never forget the terror of the submarine war. The constant fear of torpedo attack, the helplessness of watching ships burn, and the knowledge that death could come at any moment from beneath the waves left psychological scars that lasted decades. Many merchant sailors could never return to sea, traumatized by memories of oil-covered waters and drowning men. The Japanese Navy's inability to protect merchant shipping exposed a fundamental flaw in Japanese strategic thinking. The empire had expanded across the Pacific without considering how to defend the sea lanes that connected its scattered territories. The assumption that the Imperial Navy's battle fleet would destroy any threat before it could reach Japanese shipping proved fatally wrong. By early 1945, the submarine blockade had reduced Japan to a state of economic collapse. Factories shut down for lack of raw materials, cities went dark for lack of fuel oil, and civilians faced starvation for lack of imported food. The American submarines had achieved what years of bombing could not accomplish. They had brought the war home to every Japanese citizen through empty stomachs and cold homes. The technical evolution of American submarines during the war was remarkable. Problems with defective torpedoes that had plagued operations in 1942 and 1943 were solved by late 1944. New radar systems could detect Japanese ships at ranges exceeding 20 miles. Improved diesel engines gave American submarines the surface speed to outrun most escorts. By the time of the Formosa Strait Massacre, American submarines were the most advanced undersea weapons in the world. The human dimension of the submarine war was often overlooked in strategic analyses. Young American sailors, many barely out of high school, operated complex machinery in conditions of extreme danger. Japanese merchant sailors, many of them civilians pressed into service, faced death every time they left port. The submarine war was not a clean, technological conflict, but a brutal struggle where men died in darkness far from home. Commander Okane's capture after the Tang's sinking provided the Japanese with a brief propaganda victory, but it could not change the war's trajectory. The loss of one submarine, even the most successful in the fleet, did not slow the pace of sinkings. Other submarines took Tang's place in the Formosa Strait, continuing the relentless campaign against Japanese shipping. The submarine war had developed its own momentum that no single loss could stop. The Japanese attempt to create an effective anti-submarine force in 1944 came too late to make a difference. The 901st Naval Air Group, despite the dedication of its pilots, never developed effective tactics for hunting submarines. The escort vessels of the General Escort Command were too few and too poorly equipped to protect the vast number of convoys required to sustain Japan's war effort. The Empire had lost the submarine war before it truly began fighting it. The strategic impact of the submarine campaign extended beyond the Pacific War. The demonstration of submarine effectiveness against merchant shipping influenced naval planning for decades. The ability of a relatively small submarine force to cripple a major industrial nation's war effort changed how navies thought about sea control and power projection. The silent service had proven that control of the sea meant control of what moved beneath its surface. The October 24 Convoy massacre also demonstrated the importance of intelligence in modern warfare. The American ability to read Japanese codes meant that submarines could be positioned along convoy routes before the Japanese ships even left port. This intelligence advantage, combined with superior technology and tactics, made American submarine operations devastatingly effective. The Japanese never realized how thoroughly their communications had been compromised. As dawn broke on October 25, 1944, the survivors of the Convoy massacre were still being pulled from the oil-covered waters of the Formosa Strait. Many were badly burned, others were in shock, and all were traumatized by what they had experienced. The destroyer escorts, having finally stopped firing at shadows, began the grim work of recovering bodies. The convoy that had sailed with such vital supplies for the Philippines had been reduced to floating wreckage. The impact on Japanese morale was severe. News of the Convoy massacre, though censored in official reports, spread through the fleet by word of mouth. Sailors knew that every voyage might be their last, that American submarines were waiting in every strait and passage. The confidence that had characterized the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1941 had been replaced by fatalism and fear. The submarine war's effect on Japanese planning for the defense of the Philippines was immediate and severe. Without the fuel carried by the destroyed tankers, Japanese aircraft could not maintain air cover over the landing beaches. Without the ammunition destroyed with the transports, Japanese artillery could not sustain defensive barrages. The Convoy massacre had tactical implications that directly affected the land battle thousands of miles away. Vice Admiral Onishi's decision to implement kamikaze tactics shortly after the Convoy massacre was partly motivated by the submarine crisis. If conventional forces could not protect shipping or defeat American naval forces, then unconventional tactics were necessary. The kamikaze program, born from desperation, was an admission that Japan had lost the conventional war at sea. The submarines had driven Japan to suicide tactics. The American submarine force's success rate continued to climb through the end of 1944. In November, American submarines sank 62 Japanese vessels. In December, Despite worsening weather, they sank 53. Each sinking represented not just a ship lost but cargo that would never reach its destination, sailors who would never come home, and another cut in Japan's economic lifeline. The personal stories of the submarine war were often tragic. Commander Yamamoto's son, serving on a cargo ship, was killed when his vessel was torpedoed in November 1944. Captain Morita's brother, commanding a tanker, disappeared with his ship in December. The submarine war had become a personal tragedy for thousands of Japanese families who lost loved ones not in battle but in the cold economics of commerce warfare. The technological gap between American and Japanese anti-submarine capabilities continued to widen as the war progressed. American submarines received new radar warning receivers that alerted them to Japanese radar emissions. Improved sonar systems made American submarines harder to detect when submerged. Advanced torpedo data computers increased hit probability. Meanwhile, Japanese escorts still relied on primitive sonar sets and depth charges that had changed little since 1941. The submarine blockade's impact on Japanese civilian morale was profound. By early 1945, the average Japanese citizen could see the effects of the submarine war in every aspect of daily life. Rice rations were cut repeatedly as imports dwindled. Fuel shortages meant that public transportation was reduced to essential services only. The submarine war had brought the conflict into every Japanese home through shortage and privation. The final months of the submarine war saw American submarines operating in the Sea of Japan itself, using new mine detection sonar to penetrate minefields that the Japanese had thought impenetrable. The appearance of American submarines in Japan's home waters shattered the last illusion of safety. If submarines could operate within sight of the Japanese coast, then nowhere was safe from American attack. The story of the October 24, 1944, Convoy massacre would be studied at naval academies for generations. It demonstrated how technological superiority, superior intelligence, aggressive tactics, and individual courage could combine to produce decisive results. A single submarine had inflicted more damage in one night than entire squadrons of surface ships might accomplish in weeks of operations. The human cost of the submarine war was felt long after the conflict ended. Japanese merchant sailors who survived torpedo attacks often suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They could not forget the screams of drowning men, the smell of burning oil, or the terror of waiting for the next torpedo to strike. The submarine war had left invisible wounds that never fully healed. Commander Yamamoto survived the war and later became a vocal advocate for maritime safety. He never forgot the October night when his convoy was destroyed, when he watched helplessly as ships burned and men died. In his memoirs, he wrote that the American submarines had been like demons from the deep, striking without warning and disappearing without trace. They had turned the Pacific Ocean from a highway of empire into a graveyard of Japanese ambitions. The legacy of the submarine war extended beyond military history. The demonstration that a nation's economy could be destroyed by attacking its merchant shipping influenced strategic thinking during the Cold War. The ability of submarines to operate independently for extended periods in enemy waters became a model for nuclear submarine operations. The silent service had not just won a war but had changed how future wars would be fought. As the sun set on October 25, 1944, the Formosa Strait was littered with the debris of Japan's shattered convoy. Oil slicks stretched for miles, marking where ships had died. Life rafts drifted with their cargoes of dead and dying sailors. The destroyer escorts continued their futile search for the American submarine, not knowing that the Tang lay on the bottom, destroyed by her own torpedo. The Convoy massacre was over, but its implications would resonate until Japan's final surrender. The submarine war in the Pacific had demonstrated a fundamental truth of modern warfare. Victory did not always come from dramatic battles between capital ships or massive amphibious invasions. Sometimes it came from patient, relentless pressure applied to an enemy's vulnerabilities. The American submarines had found Japan's vulnerability in its dependence on maritime commerce and had exploited it with ruthless efficiency. The October 24, 1944, Convoy massacre in the Formosa Strait would be remembered as the night when Japanese convoy commanders truly understood they had lost the war at sea. The American submarines had evolved from a minor threat to an existential danger that Japan could not counter. The silent service had proven that, in modern war, the most dangerous enemy was often the one you could not see until it was too late.